Good evening, and welcome to this workshop of the Board of Education. Tonight, the Board of Education will hear updates from Superintendent of Schools, Dr. Mark Bedell, and his staff on the school system's work as it relates to early literacy. Tonight's workshop is open to the public, but no public questions or testimony will be taken. This workshop is being broadcast live on ACPS TV, which can be found on Channel 96 on Comcast and Astound, and Channel 36 on Verizon. High-definition broadcasts can be seen on Channel 996 on Comcast, Channel 496 on Astound, and Channel 1961 on Verizon. The workshop can also be viewed live on ACPS YouTube channel. Thank you for joining us. Good evening, Dr. Bedell.
I'm all over the place right now. All right. So thank you, Madam President, and to the individuals who are here today in person or either viewing this virtually. Thank you for attending this workshop tonight. We have an opportunity tonight to engage in a conversation around early literacy and taking a look at our data. As you all know, literacy is the cornerstone of learning for our students. And if we can really help our kids have the ability to be able to read at a high level by the time they enter the third grade, it really changes the trajectory in their ability to be able to access content far and above and beyond just literacy in itself. You also, in addition to getting an overview of what the school district's doing in this space, looking at being able to hear about some of our data. Also, I want everybody to understand, like, this district is committed to moving forward with becoming a science for reading school district. And we'll talk a little bit about that as they close out their slide decks as we continue to move the school district forward. So with that being said, we have three of our staff members led by our Assistant Superintendent of Curriculum Instruction, Michelle Batten. I will allow the three of you to introduce yourselves for the record, and let's get into it.
Good evening. Let's start. I'll let my two amazing coordinators and academics introduce themselves.
Good evening. I'm Trish Sanook. I'm the coordinator of Early Childhood Education and School Readiness.
Good evening. My name is Jane Gill, and I'm the coordinator of Elementary Reading and Integrated Literacy.
All right. Thank you for inviting us this evening to share our data on early literacy. And I also, before I begin, like to give a huge shout out to Mr. Dykstra and Dr. Katzenberger, who have been an extreme valuable partners in our slide decks this evening. And following the presentation, we certainly will answer any questions that you may have and offer clarification that's needed. So as we begin our presentation, we'd like to note alignment to our district and state goals. First, starting with the strategic plan, which does state that we will increase the percentage of students who read or are on or above grade level by the end of second grade. Our superintendent's goal, number 2, is to ensure intentional focus on instructional programming, as well as blueprint for Maryland's future, both in policy area 1, early childhood education, policy area 3, college and career, and then our Ready to Read Act. Also, you will see alignment to the science of reading and the body of research that demonstrates how children learn to read. And in AACPS, we continue to shift our practices to ensure complete alignment to what research is saying. On this slide, you see the 3 assessments we use to determine early literacy proficiency skills. And for each of these assessments, we are going to provide you context and purpose, as well as historical and current data, and then key findings, as well as takeaways. It should also be noted that in addition to the data you will see here this evening, from the district level, our schools also receive their student level data that they utilize to make instructional decisions around.
Throughout the evening, there are a couple key terms that will really help you understand the assessment. The first is a screener. A screener is a brief, valid, and reliable measurement procedure used to identify or predict whether a student may be at risk for poor learning outcomes. The second type of assessment that we'll unpack this evening is called a General Management Outcome Assessment. We'll refer to that as a GMO throughout the night. This assesses where students should be performing at a specific point in time. It measures individual growth, but another important thing to note about a GMO is that it accounts for increased curricular expectations. So the goal or the benchmark will increase over time. It doesn't stay the same throughout a school year. So we're going to look at two samples of a GMO. The first one you'll see here shows two assessments, same student. The beginning of the year, the student scored a 247, which put him in the well below range. In the middle of the year, the student scored a 321. It kept him in the well below range, even though he made improvements. So you can see the student went from 247 to 321, but because the goal increased, he stayed within that part of the graph. On the second sample here, you'll see that in the beginning of the year, this student scored a 292. So that put the student in the below goal category, or the yellow. In the middle of the year, the student scored a 353. So again, while the student made gains, because the goal increases, it looks as though on the graph that the student decreased. So as we look at GMOs throughout the evening, it's important to notice that while the student might not move levels within the graph, they might be making improvements in the actual assessment. All right, you're looking at a visual of Dr. Hollis Scarborough's reading rope. This looks familiar, I think, to many of you who participated in the board workshop in the summer of 2021 when we went over the science of reading. So you'll notice that there are different strands. This is commonly referenced when discussing the science of reading, the Scarborough's reading rope. This reading rope helps us understand what is required of a skilled reader. So you can see skilled reading on the right-hand side here, and then you can see lots of strands in the reading rope. The strands in the red represent our language comprehension skills. Those are things like background knowledge, things that we understand prior to entering a text. Vocabulary, do we understand what the words in the text mean? You can arguably assess these skills without having a child read a text. Okay, so I could read a text to a child and see if they understand these concepts or skills. The skills represented in the blue are the word recognition skills. And these are skills that are required to actually read the words on a text. So those include phonological awareness, decoding, and sight recognition. It's really critical that students have proficiency in all of these skills to become a skilled reader. And of course, that means it's important that we assess all of these skills to determine whether our students are skilled readers. Throughout the evening, we'll be coming back to this reading rope and talking about which strands of the reading rope our various assessments assess.
So the first assessment we're going to look at tonight is the Kindergarten Readiness Assessment, more commonly referred to as the KRA. The KRA is given once per year in the fall of kindergarten to each kindergarten student, and his or her classroom teacher administers the assessment to the student. The KRA is really assessing how our students enter into our kindergarten program in that fall, so it really documents kindergarten readiness. It's important that our schools and as a district, we know a child's level of kindergarten readiness, because students that enter kindergarten without the social, emotional, cognitive, or physical skills needed to access the curriculum need intervention at the start of kindergarten in order to be successful throughout their academic career. When thinking about the KRA and how it aligns to the science of reading, the KRA really provides our schools and our teachers with readiness information on all of the skills in the reading rope, both in language comprehension and in word recognition. However, because the KRA identifies these skills and assesses them in isolation, it does not provide us with a picture of the student as a skilled reader. So it really just looks at those skills in language comprehension and in word recognition. But because a child is not actively engaging with text independently, it doesn't give us that information on skilled reading. It really provides us with that background knowledge about each student. So when we think about the history and context of the KRA is a state-required assessment that started in the school year 2014-2015. It is a screener that measures readiness in 4 domains, which are literacy, mathematics, social emotional, and physical development. When thinking about how this KRA is scored, it gives us 3 levels of kindergarten readiness. The first level, indicated by the red bar on your screen, is emerging readiness. Students who enter kindergarten at the emerging readiness level are one or more years below entering kindergarten expectations. Students at the approaching readiness level, indicated by the yellow bar, enter kindergarten about a half a year below expectations. And finally, our students who enter at the demonstrating readiness level, indicated by the green bar on the screen, are entering kindergarten ready to engage with kindergarten level curriculum. This stacked bar graph shows the readiness level of kindergarten students in AACPS this fall of 2020. As you can see, 43% of our students in kindergarten this fall were fully ready, demonstrating readiness for kindergarten curriculum. 34% of our students were at that approaching readiness level, or about 6 months below expectations. And finally, we had 22% of our students at that emerging readiness level, which was about 1 or more years below entering kindergarten expectations. So when we took a closer look at our KRA data, we took a look at our students who enter kindergarten as indicated at the low socioeconomic status, thinking about our pre-kindergarten programs. Our pre-kindergarten programs in AACPS primarily serve students that qualify for the program as income eligible, as indicated by the Federal Poverty Level Index. When we filtered out the KRA data for these students that entered as an income eligible student, we compared those students in this bracket with students who had AACPS pre-kindergarten and those that did not. As you can see, students in AACPS's pre-kindergarten program demonstrated readiness for kindergarten at a much higher level than students that did not have the AACPS pre-kindergarten program. One thing to note with this data is last year we had both full and half-day pre-kindergarten programs in AACPS. This year we have converted all of our pre-kindergarten programs to full day, so we expect to see a greater increase in these levels as well on next year's administration of the KRA. And we are hopeful for these reasons that Dr. Bedell's request for our pre-kindergarten programs in next year's budget are fully funded at the county level. This line graph shows KRA results over time. As indicated earlier, the KRA started in the 2017-2018 school year with a census administration. However, for 18-19 and 19-20, state law changed. So those years, we only saw a random sampling of students given the KRA. Those students were identified by the Maryland State Department of Education, and it was about 5 to 6 students per kindergarten classroom that were given the KRA in those years. And that could account for the slight drop in student results. In 2020, 2021, the KRA was not given because it must be given face-to-face, and we did not have a virtual option for giving the KRA. It was not given in the entire state of Maryland that year. In 2021, 2022, and 2022, 2023, AACPS gave the KRA to every student for a census administration. And while we did see a slight decline coming out of the pandemic, we are showing improvements in this school year with our level of readiness, and we anticipate this trend will continue. This example of our state shows the KRA scores of fully demonstrating readiness for students throughout the state of Maryland. The KRA is the only literacy assessment with comparative state scores. And again, you can see Anne Arundel County is there with 43%, which is slightly above the state average of 40. I'm sorry. Anne Arundel County is at 43%, which is slightly above the state average of 42%. So we have some key findings from our KRA administration. Overall, 43% of our students demonstrated readiness for kindergarten this school year, which was again slightly higher than the state average of 42%. Student readiness on the KRA has fluctuated over the past few years, and the AACPS pre-kindergarten program reduces the likelihood of students at the emerging readiness level when entering kindergarten.
The next assessment we're going to review is the Dynamic Indicators of Basic Early Literacy Skills, commonly referred to as DIBELS. DIBELS is administered to all kindergarten students 3 times per year. And once students are demonstrating proficiency in the skills assessed on DIBELS, we no longer continue the assessment. So it's administered to first and second graders on a need-be basis. And our literacy teachers are the ones who administer this assessment. When we're looking back at Dr. Hollis Scarborough's reading rope, you'll notice that the word recognition strand of the reading rope is highlighted. So DIBELS does not give us information on language comprehension or overall skilled reading proficiency. It really focuses on just those word recognition skills, phonological awareness, decoding, and sight recognition. Gives us fantastic information that teachers use to inform their instruction in each of those 3 strands of the reading rope. Some context and history about DIBELS. DIBELS has been a state requirement, or I should say the screening has been a state requirement since the 2021 school year. It was as part of the Ready to Read Act, though each district had autonomy over which screener to use. We just had to meet a set of criteria. And Anne Arundel adopted DIBELS. DIBELS is a screening used to identify students who are at risk for reading difficulty. That's part of the language from the Ready to Read Act. But it is also a GMO, so it's one of those assessments that increases in expectation over time, and we do measure growth. There are 4 scores associated with the composite score on DIBELS. You'll see that intensive is in red, and that means that indicates that a student is at risk for reading difficulty. Then you'll notice in the yellow, we call that category strategic, and there is some risk associated with students who score within that range. Then there's also core and core plus. There's minimal risk of reading difficulty associated with those 2 colors. This graph shows this year's middle of the year kindergarten DIBELS results. So you'll notice about 49% of our students here in AACPS are proficient in the skills measured by DIBELS, which are, again, those word recognition strands of the reading rope. The next graph shows our middle of the year results over time. So we went with middle of the year. We do have end of year results for historical, but for comparison's sake, we wanted to stick to something comparable. So you'll see in 2021, about 16% of our students were proficient. That jumped to 35 in 21-22, and this year we're at 49. So we're pleased to see an increase in proficiency as time goes on. Do be mindful, though, this is kindergarten, so this is not a cohort of students. These are different students measured each year. So we're really not looking at growth here on this from student to student, but we're measuring different kindergarten groups of students throughout the years. Okay, and this graph shows our kindergarten, first, and second grade data from what we have so far this year. So you'll see there is a fall, a beginning of the year graph, as well as a winter or a middle of the year graph for each grade level. If you look at the kindergarten grade level only, you'll see that our levels of proficiency increase from fall to winter. And now I'm going to direct your attention to first and second grade. And you'll notice a new color that we haven't discussed yet. That color is purple. So as I mentioned earlier, we only assess students in first and second grade who have not demonstrated proficiency in the skills assessed on DIBELS. The purple in this graph represents those students. So it represents the students who at one point, it might have been kindergarten, it may have been first, or it may have been second grade, they demonstrated proficiency and we're no longer assessing them. So you can see in the first grade from fall to winter, we increase the number of the purple. So we increase the number of students who scored proficient and no longer required the assessment. As a reminder, students may have increased their score, but not moved to a different performance band. So as we referenced earlier, they may have stayed in the red, but made gains. And as Ms. Batten referred to earlier, schools are analyzing that data for every student in their building. I also just want to draw your attention to that second grade group. So you'll notice that is the group of students that was virtual in their kindergarten year of learning. So you can still see that we have, we're working to make additional gains with that group cohort of kids. So some key findings related to DIBELS. Over time, the percentage of kindergarten scoring core and core plus or proficient on DIBELS, middle of the year composite score, increased from 16% to 49%. That's a 33 percentage point gain. From the beginning of the year to the middle of the year testing, we've also seen an increase in the percentage of core and core plus from 39% to 48% in our kindergarten students. And in grades 1 and 2, there are more students identified as core or core plus at the middle of the year than there were at the beginning of the year. And our final assessment we're going to share this evening is the Fountas and Pinnell Benchmark Assessment System, commonly referred to as F&P BAS. This assessment is currently administered twice per year to all students, and our classroom teachers administer this assessment. As it relates to the science of reading, the F&P BAS gives us information on language comprehension and overall skilled reading. So you can see that that word recognition faded out. It doesn't give us specific information on the word recognition skills. However, students do read the text out loud and to themselves before they're asked questions that relate to the language comprehension skills. So they're asked about genre, language structures. There's some questions about vocabulary and some, you can tell some information about background knowledge. Because the students do read the text, that's why we can assess skilled reading or overall reading comprehension. Some history and context about the F&P BAS. It's been a district requirement since the 14-15 school year. It is a GMO used to identify reading levels and to document student progress in reading, overall reading proficiency over time. In terms of the scoring, we're going to talk about two things. So after a teacher administers the F&P BAS, they use a formula to get a letter. And you can see the chart here on the screen. I'm going to draw your attention to that first grade band. That's the one in blue. And the blue and yellow are just to help our eyes decipher between the grade levels. So as you can see in first grade, if you look in the beginning of the chart, September, the expectation is a level D. You can see, being a GMO, that the expectation increases over time. So by the time that the first grader is in June, the level of expectation is a J. In AACPS, we convert those letters to colors. So below is red, approaching yellow, on grade level expectation is green, and above is blue. So that will help us orient you with the graphs that we're about to look at. On is the actual letter within that time frame. So if we're looking at end of year first grade, on will be represented if the student is a level J. Any approaching is one letter below that. So if the student lands on letter I, that's converted to the approaching or yellow. and below will be anything below I. Above will be anything above letter J. So because we haven't given the end of year F&P BAS yet, we're going to look at last year's data. You can see in this chart, our K through 2 students, 46% of the students were proficient in the spring of 21-22, according to the F&P BAS. If we look at our historical data, you'll notice that we did not give the F&P assessment in the 1920 or 2021 school years due to the pandemic. You'll also notice that significant decrease in proficiency after the pandemic. We don't have this year's results, though we are optimistic that we'll see gains like we've seen in the other literacy-related assessments. This graph shows our fall to spring, or our beginning of the year to end of year data from last year. Again, we've looked at this year's data for DIBELS and KRA. We're looking at last year's for our F&P BAS. You can see that in all grade levels, students made gains from the fall to the spring. Some key findings related to the Fountas and Pinnell benchmark assessment system. In grades K through 2, 46% of students met or exceeded the instructional level expectations after spring testing last year. For several years, we had about 75% of our students in K through 2 meeting or exceeding those spring level expectations. However, we could see that significant decrease after the pandemic in the 21-22 school year. All grade levels had double-digit or near double-digit increases in the data from the fall to spring last year.
All right, so now we're going to take you through some takeaways. First, ACPS assessments align to the science of reading, as you've heard throughout this presentation. We have the KRA that gives us baseline data about students' readiness in the area of reading, again, associated to the reading rope. DIBELS provides us information on word recognition strand of the reading rope. And the F&P benchmark assessment system provides information on language comprehension strand of the reading rope, as well as overall skilled reading, or a student's ability to apply word recognition and language comprehension skills simultaneously. We are all seeing KRA and DIBELS have very similar percentages of students demonstrating readiness on KRA and at Core and Core Plus on the beginning of the year DIBELS. So that's that first administration, with KRA at 43.2% and our DIBELS 39.8%. As proficiency increases, the number of students who require DIBELS testing in first and second grade decrease in each administration. And for GMO type assessments, the number of students increased in the highest performance bands in DIBELS in the school year 2022-2023, an increase of 931 students, Core or Core Plus, and on the F&P assessment in school year 21-22, an increase of 2,473 students met or exceeded over the administrations. So barriers and opportunities for improvement. Kindergarten readiness. While we are at or above the state average, we still have students who come to us with gaps. Space for pre-kindergarten expansion. Space is at a premium. We continue to overturn any corner that we could possibly use as a pre-K classroom, and can also continue to seek partnerships with our private providers to offer additional seats. We continue to see where we are areas we are recovering from the pandemic. And performance differences. Like in other content areas, we continue to see performance differences for students who receive specialized services, such as students with disabilities and our English language learners. We're also seeing chronic absenteeism impact our data. Limited time for professional learning. Teaching reading is complex, and we have learned more over the last several years about best practices for reading, and many since our time in graduate or undergraduate programs. Unlike in secondary schools, most of our elementary teachers teach all subject areas, so they are generalists in teaching in all of those areas. Understanding the data and how to respond to it continues to require training and time with our teachers. We do have constraints with our contractual time to professionally develop teachers. And so we are continuing to leverage outside of the day professional development. And while we compensate our teachers to attend the professional development sessions, we are competing for time, their family schedules, personal commitments, graduate programs, other things that they're involved in. So future planning and timeline. The Maryland Leads Grant. We have resubmitted the Maryland Leads Grant for the Science of Reading and are waiting a response from MSDE. Plans are still underway to professionally develop all of our K-3 teachers, including special educators, resource staff, and administrators in the science of reading over the next 2 years. I would like to note that all literacy teachers, early intervention teachers, instructional support teachers, and cohorts of K-3 teachers and special educators across the district have already participated in attending LETRS training. Also, our early intervention teachers are in the process of receiving their Orton-Gillingham certification. Just around the corner is our next budget cycle, and considerations for funding requests will be underway. And on the horizon is our review and evaluation of an early literacy curriculum to ensure alignment to the science of reading. And with that, I thank you, and we were happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Ms. Batten. Thank you all. So we will go around as our usual. Each member can do 2 questions per round, and if we have additional, we'll do another round. And I believe tonight we begin with you, Ms. Scholheim.
Firstly, thank you so much. This is a really thoughtfully done presentation, and I appreciate the level of detail provided to all of us. And I just thank you for your time in preparing it. I do have a couple questions. I'm just trying to get my head wrapped around the use of F&P and DIBELS simultaneously. Is it because, let me see if I heard correctly, is it because one focuses on comprehension and skilled reading overall, and the other one focuses on phonics and decoding? Is that the reason why we're still using both together?
Correct, yes.
Oh, excellent. Great. And then does that line up with what the state expects from us?
The state requires us to use a screener. And DIBELS is the screener that we've adopted here in AACPS. At this time, they don't require an additional assessment. As you could see, they we would be lacking information about language comprehension and overall skilled reading proficiency if we didn't have the F&P BIS assessment.
Okay.
So that's a district decision at this point in time.
Oh.
The only state requirement is the early literacy screener as part of the Ready to Read Act.
So as a follow-on to that, they DIBELS is the primary and F&P is the backup for our local knowledge of the overall reading comprehension and skilled reading.
Yes.
All right, great. And my only other question at this point is, and I missed the name of it, and I apologize for that, on the when you were talking about the commitment to professional development and the science of reading, you mentioned a certification. What was the name of that?
Orton-Gillingham.
Gillingham. Excellent. I thank you again for this. This is wonderful, and I like seeing the data, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and where we are and where we want to go. So, yeah, thank you so much. I don't have any other questions at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Schalheim. Mr. Silkworth.
Thank you. I would clearly like to thank all of you for the presentation. I taught for 49 years, but I cannot tell you that I am a reading expert. But I can tell you that I'm concerned about student outcomes. And when it comes to student outcomes, that's something that we as a board need to be focused on much, much more than we have been. And so I may just have comments, not necessarily questions, maybe one or two. I looked at the map at the counties and I see the state average is 42 and we're at 43. I hope there are people that are not saying, hey, we've done such a great job, because I don't know that we have. I do look at Worcester County at 73, the highest in the state, and they're off on the Eastern Shore, and it makes me wonder, what are they doing to have achieved so much more than all of the other counties in the state? We do have surrounding counties like Carroll at 55, Howard 54, Garrett 53, Washington at 53. But even when I look at that data, I say to myself, I don't think we should be proud of that, because I don't think that really does our students the best. Again, I made a comment here on my note that this student data really concerns me.
Mr. Silkworth,
Yes.
if we could add regarding the 73%, that I think it's all schools have a full day pre-kindergarten program.
So it is a
okay.
universal full-day pre-K in that county, and all families have access to a Judy Center.
Well, that clearly makes a difference. And so when it comes to our funding and so forth, we're pushing for that. But again, I guess I look at the Dibble results, and I see that 48% of our kids were in the green or the blue. But then I go back and I see that we have 51 or more percent of our kids that are not even close. And so it makes me wonder what is impacting our kids. And I have some ideas about that. It's clear in my mind that socioeconomic conditions are going to impact our kids. But what else is impacting our kids? And I guess from a general standpoint, there's a great amount of data here. And I know this gentleman over here is a data guy. So I know for sure that he's going to be diving into this data, as we're all going to be doing. And I trust him to dive into the data. But I guess my question is, I think back in my last few years of teaching, and I think of one particular student who was a discipline problem. And I had a conversation with him separate from other kids. And he said to me, Mr. Silkworth, why are you even talking to me? Why do you care? And I said, because I understand that you're important to me as a student. And what we determined from that conversation is this young man was a ninth grader. He said, Mr. Silkworth, I can't read. And it makes me wonder how many of our students would tell a teacher mentor today that very same thing. So having said that, again, I don't have any other real questions, but again, I appreciate everything that you've done to provide us with this information, this data. And I know that that gentleman there is going to be doing that data dive. And I have all of the confidence in the world that he's going to come up with some strategies so that we can bypass Worcester County and get up into the 80s and the 90s. So thank you all so much.
Thank you, Mr. Selkworth. Ms.
May
Frank?
we make one
Oh,
note, just as we
please.
talk about early readiness, and I'd like Ms. Zainab to share, she's part of the Joint Commission on the Opportunity Gap. And so when we talk about kindergarten readiness, that's a major role she plays with our partners outside the school system.
So the Joint Commission on the Opportunity Gap, we meet monthly. I am one of Dr. Bedell's representatives, and I serve as the co-chair. The Joint Commission is working actively with our community partners to increase kindergarten readiness for our students. They are advocating for increased funding at the district and state level for pre-kindergarten programs, as well as supporting families and private childcare providers, childcare centers with increasing student readiness, in providing them with the information that they need in order to help their child be ready when they enter kindergarten.
Thank you.
Thank you. Can I just make one comment? So thank you so much for that. What we know, and what I know, is if our focus on achieving much, much greater student outcomes at the pre-K level and grades 1 and 2, if we get that under control, and if we fix that, it's going to fix everything else. So thank you again.
Thank you. Ms. Frank?
Yes, thank you. So as you mentioned, it is actually Worcester, and they're very particular about that.
I apologize to all of our stakeholders and our friends in Worcester County.
As long as you don't say Worcestershire. So I do have some friends in some of these other counties on the local boards out there. I have some friends in Worcester, Garrett, Washington, and I would be happy to reach out to a couple of those folks and maybe connect with some of them and see if they have any best practices for us. I would be happy to do that, and maybe if you're interested, I can connect to as well. I had a couple of questions. The first question is on the slide on page 5, we had the Scarborough rope again. It doesn't say what the sort of time frames for each of these skills and each of these within the classroom are. So obviously a lot of us on this board are very phonetically focused. So what is the sort of the breakdown in the classroom of how much do we teach phonics? How much do we teach other avenues of balanced literacy?
So currently we have 30 minutes for every student in grades K through 2 that is solely dedicated towards that word recognition piece. In grades 3, we also have another 45 minutes of instruction that's used to differentiate the instruction. So students who need additional time focused on the word recognition strand of the reading rope, that time is dedicated to that for those students. And for other students who are demonstrating areas of need in the language comprehension strand, we focus on that for those students. There are other parts in the day that focus on the language comprehension or that skilled reading piece where students are reading text and comprehending the text, applying both of those sets of skills at the same time. So we have about 2 hours dedicated to literacy in K through 2. 30 minutes is completely dedicated to word recognition for all students. We have that 45 minutes that's dedicated towards that differentiated piece. So students who really demonstrate areas of need in word recognition are getting focused instruction there. Students who are demonstrating areas of need in language comprehension are getting focused instruction in that area. And then there are other parts like interactive read aloud. I know, Ms. Frank, you were part of the workshop where we talked about all of the different components. Interactive read aloud is where the teacher reads to the students in a whole class setting and asks questions related to the skills associated with the language comprehension strand.
Specifically for the phonetic piece of it, so that's the word recognition encompasses several different pieces. So how much of that 30 minutes goes to phonetic awareness or teaching phonetical skills?
Are you The entire block, the
Okay.
entire 30 minutes. And a scope and sequence is developed based on research. So we use programs that are research based and evidence based, where depending on the time of year, it really focuses perhaps more heavily on phonological awareness, which is really, can you hear the sounds before you can identify them or use them? They've got to be able to recognize them. So those are things like rhyming. In the beginning of kindergarten, we'll see instruction really focused on that. And then it might move more towards decoding in first and second grade, as well as focused on that sight recognition part as well. So that 30-minute block, it really depends where students are on the continuum from K through 3, as well as throughout the school year.
But in kindergarten, there's a much bigger push towards the phonetic part, and then it moves into the decoding and the sight recognition as they get a little older.
Yes,
Okay.
and I would go even back to pre-K. Our
To
pre-K,
yes.
program has a very strong focus on phonological awareness.
For our pre-kindergarten students, they get a minimum of 15 minutes a day on phonological awareness, plus additional small group instruction as needed. In the decoding, which in pre-K, we focus mainly on that alphabetic principle, connecting that letter to the sound it most commonly represents, and then also letter identification, which is a key indicator for readiness in moving towards being able to be an independent reader. We have an additional 30 minutes a day in our full day pre-K devoted to that, and then additional small group instructional time as needed by students' observational assessment.
Okay, and has that increased?
That has increased when we've moved to full day, as well as with our new adoption of our pre-kindergarten curriculum for this school year.
Okay, yeah, I think the last time I asked that question, it was a little less.
Yes, so we have, because of our DIBELS results, we have increased it. In addition, the curriculums that we are now using in our pre-kindergarten program were designed to align with the science of reading.
Okay, and then I have one more question. Do I have another?
Since there are fewer of us here tonight, I think you can
Thank
go ahead and ask another
We'll
question.
call that a follow-up to the first. The other question I have, and I may have had the same question last time we had a presentation as well. I know that we don't have a really comprehensive history of the long-term numbers for the pre-readiness. I believe you said that we started, I think it was like 2018 for the
KRA 2017.
yeah, okay. Was it 17? Okay. Are we continuing to look at long-term, those kids that started and that we tested in 2017, are we looking at them to say, are they actually staying at a higher level compared to the folks? Are we tracking that? Are we continuing to track that and to see with the data that we gathered originally, are we continuing to see what their levels are comparatively?
So we do have that information and we can get it to you.
Okay, thank you.
And that has also been studied at the state level as well.
I have a lot of comments about state level testing right now, but I'm gonna cede my microphone.
Thank you, Ms. Frank. Ms. Corkadell.
Thanks. So my first set of questions are relevant to slide 12. So I couldn't help but notice that our emerging numbers are pretty much the same, regardless of whether or not they went through our pre-K system or not. Have we been able to drill down and identify those commonalities among those students so that we are better prepared, perhaps?
So yes, when we took a closer look at those students, there was two factors that came into consideration. A, they might not have had a full year of pre-K. So this includes a student, they would be counted as part of our pre-K population, say if they enrolled in March. So it would be just 3 months of school. The other common factor is the students that were still scoring at the emerging readiness level had 20 days or more absenteeism in the pre-K program, or they were consistently tardy. So they were missing a large chunk of instruction, especially literacy instruction.
But I guess maybe I didn't word it well, although that's excellent information, and answers part of it. But what have we identified a, you know, socioeconomic is one way to identify students when they're coming in. Are there other challenges that we're consistently seeing? A third of our students in that emerging level, because when I pull some of those earlier year numbers, there would be no way that could have existed. So I'm just wondering if we have identified that, so we can get in earlier with those groups, because it seems to me that the pre-K versus no pre-K is not changing. That 1/3 of our students are in that emerging red flag category. So I guess, what is the group that is sitting in the red?
So I'll begin with that. Trish and her team are unpacking that literacy domain for the KR administration to see where we need to make some curriculum changes. And so one was last year, or for this school year, having a new program to hopefully identify those specific areas that we need to drill down on with our students. So curriculum changes were made. That's one. Also with training, we continue to leverage opportunities as best we can with our teachers to specifically in our pre-K programs to make sure we're focusing on specific skill deficits that then will impact them in kindergarten on the KRA.
Let me,
Yeah. 'Cause
so I'm trying to make sure I'm understanding your question, because what I'm hearing from you is, if they came in the fall, we don't really have data on them. So this is their first initial snapshot of how these kids
Correct.
are performing.
Mhm.
And what you're asking is, do we know what conditions are in place prior to them coming to us? Have we been able to determine?
like English language learners.
Like, so what are the
those who
barriers? That's what I'm hearing.
Yeah, like
So it's
who's
not a
sitting in my
curriculum
group? Yeah.
thing at this point.
Yeah.
It's what is happening that is ultimately having students, regardless of whether they've had pre-K experience or not, they're entering into our system, and 36 or 37% of them. So what are the conditions that have created this potentially, or variables? And if we don't know it, if we don't know
Oh,
it,
yeah,
that's
that-
fine. But
That's fine.
I think I'm trying to make sure I'm
Mhm.
understanding what you're asking. That's what it
Yes.
sounds like.
That your clarification is
Okay.
accurate.
So for
yes.
our pre-kindergarten students, absenteeism played a role. Also, our students who have a specialized, an IEP or an IFSP
Mhm.
for specialized instruction, as well as students whose home language is something other than English.
Okay, that does make sense. Okay, and then, so to okay, no, that made sense. And then I would be curious, just as a side note, not for an answer today, or if you did, that would be like total rock star stuff. But I would suggest maybe that I'd like to see how many in that emerging, based on like a map back over to our identified community schools, to see how many we're going to be able to capture that are coming in that category. Does that make sense? That we are, in other words, I'd be curious to see how many of the community schools that the state has identified in its criteria are lining up with the students who are coming in the red. Does that make sense? Yeah, just as more data becomes available. And then my other question was on slide 32. Let me get over to it myself here. So, as it relates to barriers on professional learning and planning time, I would like to see because I know that the state keeps adding complexities and new systems of how the teachers operate, obviously has changed over time. When we were in the 78 number, in that much higher number profile in F&P, I would be curious to see how much training time our professional staff was receiving, as well as how much planning time they were also getting, so that we know specifically where and how to target our resources to help remove the barriers. Is that something we could look into?
Oh, I have so many thoughts on this question. Do you all want to go before I respond?
Yeah, it doesn't have to be like a question and answer tonight, but that was my.
Go ahead, Dr.
No, because I mean, you raise a question that is, there are so many factors at play that can potentially throw us off on where we were from 4 years ago or pre-COVID. And one of them just around this piece of teachers being able to have time. And we've been talking about the lack of time. Where we have all of these vacancies, that is also, I think, really taken away from planning time, because if people are being paid to cover classes, that makes it a lot harder. I think that you also run into this scenario of understaffed schools now having student-teacher ratio far more than where it needs to be. So that then makes it sometimes even harder to then become much more intentional on how you respond to individual students and how they perform. But from a PD standpoint, that's something that I have to look into. I don't know what the difference is if they were getting more time then versus where they are now. But I also know that it tends to make it even more difficult to have people out of our schools when we need people for coverage. And I think you have the attendance rates of teachers increasing from a stress factor where it's so much that I think compounds when you don't have a full complement of a staff that ultimately then impacts this kind of data. And so that would be my response to some of it, outside of not really having knowledge of is there a decreased amount of professional development time. We do know not having enough professional development time is a significant barrier. And it was something that I was fighting for in my last school district, more time for our teachers to have PD. And it was a fight.
Well, on the class size reduction, that's always been one of my biggest things to champion since well before I sat in any of these seats up here. And that's what I'm getting at, that I want to be careful and purposeful that we are not implementing something to fix that which is temporary or transient. I think transient would probably be the better word for it, when we should be building in to that, here's where the norm should be. And that's why I think looking at that number would be significant, because understanding what that is also, I think, will help us evaluate the impacts and implications when we go to instruct a new bright space type of system, or we go to a different approach, or the frequency of changing of things, additional administration of testing, all those things I think would play a role. I would be curious just to see that before directly addressing some of that, because as you point out, you're absolutely right. It's very woven in, but I do think that would be a good, somehow we were at a good sweet spot there, where the teachers either already had a strong comprehension of the curriculum, because a lot of changes have occurred frequently, in recent years. And so that would be the other thing for us to be looking at is, how familiar are our teachers? And with new teachers and all the hiring we have to do, I got to presume some onboarding time and some other integration would play a role in that as well, to get us back to that sweeter spot. Because Mr. Silkworth is correct. I'm struggling to find anything more What I do know is that we are on the path to getting it reconciled, and that's the important, hopeful part of these numbers. But I do have one or two more, but I don't want to take up the whole if time permits. I had just some follow-up, more curiosities.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll ask a couple of questions and then I'll ask if there are additional. So while we're on the subject of coverage, we have literacy specialists, reading teachers in school buildings. Given the vacancies that we have this year, obviously PD is important. Are those folks stepping in and pulling groups of kids to help? Because I know we're thin on the ground and we're recovering from the pandemic. So
Yes, we have literacy teachers supporting student groups, as well as providing the job-embedded professional development, whether it's through collaborative planning, the school PD calendar. So we do partner with our administrators to maximize that time as much as possible.
Mhm.
They also do some side-by-side coaching or modeling for a teacher of a
Mhm.
lesson, and then debriefing with the teacher to help the teacher's everyday practice as well.
But if you have, for example, an experienced teacher, right, who knows what they're doing, but has a large class, has a lot of kids in need, we're pulling from those literacy folks to come in and take that other group or another group to help. Okay. I do think, and I'm sure you're looking at this, I would like to see at some point this data really disaggregated among subgroups because, clearly, even when we were at 78, that number varied tremendously depending on where you were. And as with all data, in my limited experience, Dr. Bedell's the data expert, not me. My degrees are in theoretical things, so I'm the last person you should talk to about data. But anyway, my sense is the value of it is to be precise with it, as precise as you can be, so you can target exactly where the problems are, which I would presume also includes staffing decisions, resource decisions for each, for the buildings and the classrooms where that's needed. And by that, I also mean the teachers who we know have success in teaching reading. So that's really not a question, it's just my comment and concern, which I know is a concern of yours, Dr. Bedell, as well. Do we have, at this point, and let me preface this by saying, the science of reading has been discussed tonight. It's my understanding that where that really comes in is curricular and the kind of training, and certainly letters is a core part of that. I believe that's the system that came out of the Mississippi project. And do we have any data at this point that really can show us sort of how teachers who have had that training are doing relative to teachers who haven't, or will we be trying to find that?
We can look at our cohorts.
We don't have that data yet,
Yeah.
but I think that's a great idea, and we certainly can get that. Many of our teachers, it's a 90-hour course in total. So many of our teachers are about halfway through that course. And the first half of the course, the first 45 hours, focuses on the word recognition strand. The second half focuses on the language comprehension strand. And so that comprehensive, the course in its entirety, I think, is really important before we start looking at how it's translating to practices, because teachers can just apply part of the word recognition strategies or part of the strands, but not the other part, and that might influence the data too. So that's a great idea. We are partnering with our professional growth and development offices to see how we can track that, which students have completed the course, and then tying that to data with our research team
I-
over there is
I
a great next
asked-
step.
I ask this with, dare I say, malice aforethought, because as one of the people who advocates for this budget every year, part of my job is to be able to show the difference,
Mhm.
right? Not just, well, we know it's good to have people trained in this way, but if we can really show when this teacher or these teachers get this training, we see X, which I'm hoping is what we will see, but that's a whole different ballgame, frankly. And just as it came up with Worcester County that, they have universal pre-K, and guess what? It shows. And I would guarantee you that they're spending less money on the back end than we are. So again, to put on my hard-nosed fiscal hat, to make those kinds of arguments to our funders, it is incumbent on us to be able to demonstrate, in the greatest possible detail and starkest terms, what we get if we fund these things and what we lose if we don't. So that's just a plea, as somebody who, beats up funders on a regular basis. So, okay. So let's do another round if there are any additional questions. Ms. Schallheim.
Well, I just want to say with my mic on, what you just said was spot on. And thank you for that. I don't have any further questions. But I also agree with your disaggregated data request for sure, because we know within that we're going to see huge gaps between various groups, as we do with everything else. And how do we target those kids to decrease those gaps is very important. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Schallheim. Mr. Silkworth.
So I would like to totally agree with Ms. Schallheim and Dr. Toba. I clearly would like to see disaggregated data. Not having been a data guy, I have the most respect for the data guy. And so, but I'm going to throw something else out there, and I'm not quite sure how relevant it might be, but I'm a product of this school system. I went to Park Elementary, Brooklyn Park Elementary, Brooklyn Park Junior Senior High School. And I think I have an excellent command of the English language. So how did that happen? I didn't go to kindergarten because, there was no kindergarten back in the day. I didn't come from a rich family. I mean, there were 6 kids, 2 parents. Father worked 2 or 3 jobs. Mother stayed at home, took care of us. My English background was actually not formed in elementary school. It was really, now my reading background was, but my English, the background is in grade 7 through 9. There were 3 teachers who happened to have a great impact on me and so many of my friends. And they actually, one in particular, taught us about the parts of the language, the English language. So, if you're going to have somebody fix your motor, you want them to know what are the parts, how do they function, how do you take it apart. You should be able to put it back together again without you blindfolded. I mean, you should be able to do that. And one of the strategies that was used that really helped me was something that I've heard some of my colleagues speak very negatively about, and that's this monster of diagramming sentences. Well, guess what? We were in a Montessori school, back in the fall. And as we were walking around, they have lots and lots of manipulatives, which I did too when I was teaching. I had a lot of buttons, I had a lot of things. But I looked at one set of manipulatives and asked them what that was for. And the student said, oh, those manipulatives are there to help us understand the concept of diagramming sentences. Hello. That was wonderful for me to see that, because the challenge that we had, we were not in the hallway as a seventh grader. We were running to our class because the teacher had written this sentence. It was almost a mile long. And we wanted to be the first one to be able to diagram it and then explain the function. And guess what? We didn't get candy. We didn't get anything. We got the satisfaction of doing it. So I'm only putting that out there just to say that here's one guy that graduated from Anne Arundel County, and that particular strategy did work. Now, for what it might mean to this, I don't know. But I just want to make that point. Thank you.
And that is how you grow a French teacher.
Oh, let me say one final thing. Thank you for saying that. Let me say one final thing, and that is, and this may be anecdotal, but for 49 years, I can't tell you how many of my students would come to me and they would say to me, Mr. Silkworth, we learn more about our English language in our WCL classes. And I always found that to be a compliment on one hand. But then as I think about it now, it makes me wonder, they should be learning more about their English in their English classes.
Thank you, Mr. Silkworth. Ms. Frank?
I second everything that Mr. Silkworth just said. I also was an Anne Arundel County Public School student. I don't see sentence diagramming like I used to. I agree that the more we try to reinvent the wheel, the more we lose the locomotive aspect of it. So I appreciate your comments greatly, and I absolutely agree with them. I did actually have one more question. The KRA testing, you said in the 21 school year, we didn't, or was it the 22-21 school year, we did not test the kindergartners because it was a face-to-face test. Did you retest the emerging first graders when they came back to see where they were after the year of virtual?
We would have assessed them through our other progress monitoring tools, but not the KRA. That's only kindergarten administration. So then that year we would have begun with our DIBELS. That was our first year of DIBELS with first grade.
Why wouldn't you want to see the relative data there? Is there a reason?
So under the law, we can only give the KRA to entering kindergarten students. We cannot give it to first grade students.
You cannot.
Cannot.
Okay. All right. I think that's all I have for that. I appreciate it. Thank you very much. I would love to see a greater return to some of the tried and true methods that Mr. Silkworth brought up, and strongly advocate for that. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Corkadell?
Thanks. I do have a couple quick ones. And again, not necessarily for today, but slide 25, I would be curious to see on the progress monitoring. I think it may help us in what type of programs we need for summer and who we need for summer, to better understand the percentage of students who dropped, who maybe in June at kindergarten were at level D, maybe didn't quite carry over the D to the fall, because that's something that I've consistently heard for decades, that one of our challenges is retaining and retention. And at this stage, it would be more core than it would be, build upon. So I'm wondering, do we track that data? And is that something?
That would be something we could look into, getting that information of our students. And Mrs. Gill works closely with our summer programs to determine the resources that they utilize to help with the progression of those skills, so that there's a continuity of language instruction that teachers are utilizing in that separate program.
Yeah, because it seems to me like that would be a good point, because it's already identified data. It's just a matter of, and it's already assigned to the student. So it would just be a matter of determining that, so that we can start to get a better story surrounding the students who are not carrying over between the years. So if we looked at it kindergarten to first, when we could, then that student may be one of those kids who we give a special invitation to for summer programs. But to that effort, I am curious, just like if I take a walk down memory lane, like Mr. Silkworth did, I got my kindergarten readiness test well before I sat in a kindergarten seat, and that we were only half day. And nursery school was maybe, but not really, in our area. So, and if it was not curricular based, it was different. So I'm wondering if we know if 30% of my kids are coming in not ready, and I knew that, who they were before we started the school year, then I'm missing like a whole summer where we could have helped them be more comparable to their peers, and also determine, so that when they do enter into our classroom, do they need someone already there? Because if we start that in the fall, and then when do we get the data back, we've already missed, it seems to me, a percentage of that. And as I said, I know that, my student had an IEP from 15 months old, so we had constant benchmarks. So I have no way of knowing. And my daughter started at a private school, her kindergarten years. So I didn't notice when we stopped determining whether they were ready for that kindergarten seat. Is there any insight can someone give me a little history on that, or why we would stop doing that? Because I feel like we're missing time.
So I hope I'm answering your question correctly. So forgive me
Mhm.
if I'm off base. One thing we have started doing is for these rising 5-year-olds that haven't been in our pre-K programs, we're offering an early launch at our elementary schools. While it's only an 8-day session, we are opening those seats to bring them into the school setting prior to the school year starting. I know with Trish's work on JCOG, looking at other things that we can do in our communities for students who are not participating in pre-K. If they're in our pre-K programs, we know who they are. So we do intentionally invite them into the summer programming component as well, so that, transitions them into kindergarten. It's not always knowing where those students are, but you made a point earlier about our community schools and how we continue to provide those wraparound services. So really understanding our families' needs, then we're going to be able to do even more outreach.
Okay, yeah, because it seems to me like that old system of test the kid before they show up, because a readiness is indicating, are you ready to sit in the seat, to me? And not to dwell on semantics, but there would be something to be said about having everything all ready to roll. Now, I know that we don't do the separation, like a whole class that is maybe sitting in that red, tested in that red. However, I do know that the students that do come in would have it right from the gate out, and maybe be better prepared.
So the state sets the window for the kindergarten readiness assessment.
Of course.
We cannot give it at the end of the pre-kindergarten year. We cannot give it until they are legally a kindergarten student under the definition. We cannot even we cannot give the assessment until the student is in the KRA system. That upload cannot happen until mid-August, and the assessment cannot be given until the student is assigned a teacher of record and has a state-issued ID number. That number is issued by the Maryland State Department of Education, not MSDE.
So is there other tests that when a child enrolls that we could, no, I guess not.
So
No.
Surveying.
Not
we
really.
could do surveys and things like that. I would just hate to double test a child.
Well, yeah.
when
that's
they're
what
enrolling.
Yeah. Okay. I don't think I have any more questions surrounding that. Oh, I did have one follow-up. Since it sounds like we can't really test them till they're already in kindergarten, if they're ready for kindergarten. Uh, why would we not identify those who have word recognition skills in the blue rope at that early on? Because wouldn't that be an indicator of the potential of possibly an early entry of gifted, talented? Or like that, I'm just curious why they don't. I mean, that's not an us thing, but more of just an understanding what we can get out of that and what we cannot.
So on the KRA, we get information on the individual skills in both word recognition and language comprehension. At the start of kindergarten, we give students the KRA given by the classroom teacher and DIBELS, which is given by the literacy teacher, that gives us more information
And that
on that.
Picks up that
Yes.
essential data. Okay. No, I was just wondering for all the things that the state is, just to omit a string didn't make sense, but that's more of a state thing. But okay. No more questions. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Ms. Corkadell. Yeah, I have a couple of more questions. So if we want to go head to head on diagramming, I used to teach ancient Greek, and I had students who began to understand their own language in college for the first time. Yeah. So, but the point being, I'm on what you're hearing a few of us, I think, in my case, maybe it's just because I'm old, but I do think to me, education in general, reading in particular, is largely about freedom, right? It's about the ability to literally decode your world. And to Mr. Silkworth's analogy, this idea that if you don't know the components, you can't make it the work for yourself, right? And in which case you're kind of tethering people when it's just sort of a morass. It's the equivalent to me of learning a musical instrument by ear rather than learning how to read music. And I just say that as a general statement because I just think we need to think carefully about what we're offering our children in terms of their ability to set themselves up for what the end result of education is, in my view, which is the ability to lead a fulfilling, productive life and make determinations for yourself. That being said, Mr. Silkworth also alluded to the fact that some of us visited a Montessori school, and it's no secret I was involved with Montessori, and Dr. Bedell is familiar with Montessori as well. And I'm curious about something else, which is the relationship between writing and reading. In Montessori, one of the famous sort of statements Maria Montessori always said, which I'm sure you're familiar with, is that writing comes before reading, right? That there's a tactile relationship with letters and words that forms a kind of ground on which children begin. It's part of that background knowledge, but it's a critically tactile part of background knowledge. And the reason I raise that is I want to ask about, within the reading programs that we have, how computers are used, because obviously computers are valuable things. I'm not trying to do away with them. I am concerned, based on various pieces of research that I've read, about the difference between reading and comprehension on a screen versus reading and comprehension when you're holding a book, and the ability to dissect what you're reading, right? To begin to sort of work through the components. At the university level, I'll just give you an example. So I have taught a lot of long, complex philosophical authors. And there's fairly good research that keeping hold of a long, complex argument requires the ability to sort of look at the book and know where certain things are. So if I teach Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, which is, 2 big, thick books, the idea that somebody can sort of note where something is helps their understanding. Whereas the downloaded version does not do the same. It's just endless text, right? And I've been concerned, just for the record, at the higher ed level, that it's becoming increasingly the case that downloads are free, books you buy are not. So the students who get only the downloads tend to be the students with the least number of resources, and that's a barrier, right, to their understanding. That's just an aside. But I am curious as to, especially given that we're talking about very young children here, how are we using computers? Are we using computers for these comprehension skills, or are we sticking with sort of in the hand text that kids can work on?
So I'll start. The computer programs that we're using right now is with iReady. So
Mhm.
that's considered a supplemental
Mhm.
component, and so it really is. It is computer adaptive, so it builds with
Right.
the student's skill level. So that is not yet used for direct instruction. Direct instruction is with the classroom teacher with that book in hand and the instructional strategies in place. So I'll let these two continue to elaborate a little bit more, but really it is about having books in the hands of our students.
In our 3 and 4-year-old and kindergarten programs, we do not have e-text for our students to engage in. They only engage with the physical copies of the book. And we also, in our 4-year-old pre-kindergarten program, place an emphasis on connecting the letter or the grapheme to the sound. So we are working with our teachers to know a letter really isn't known until a student can write it as well,
Mhm.
just to bring up to something that you were talking about with
Okay.
writing.
I would echo exactly what these two say. I think there are increasing opportunities for an encounter with text on a digital platform as students progress through elementary
Mhm.
school. So by 5th grade, you'll see more of a balance of the
Mhm.
two things. But in all of our grade levels, students have books in hand and pencils in hand. So they have opportunities for both.
Mhm.
But in the primary grades, the majority of our
Mhm.
instruction, aside from the iReady, my path
Mhm.
is with
Mhm.
handheld text and pencils.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. That's all I have. Thank you all very much. This was hugely, hugely helpful, I think, to all of us. And I know a lot of work went into it. We greatly appreciate it. I would simply say, Dr. Bedell, as we often do, obviously the focus of this is now how are we going to move forward? And so we're going to obviously our job is to make sure that things are going in the right direction. And so at some point we're going to revisit this and see where we are.
All right, not a problem at all. And the data broken down. No, we were smiling when you brought that up. I mean, we had that discussion. So we will make sure that we get the data dissected and broken down by student groups for you all too. And hopefully that's the goal, to update you all in the future on the transitioning process that we will be undertaking.
Mhm. All right. Well, thank you all very much. Thank you to everyone who was here. I know Mr. Dykstra and others also were very much involved in this. And thanks for all your work.
Great job. Thank you all.